Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Elena Maris. Today, we return to a case that has haunted Connecticut, and so many questions that still hang in the air. The Cheshire murders, the home invasion, the fire, the deaths of Jennifer, Hayley, and Michaela Petit in July of 2007, and the life-changing injuries to Dr. William Petit. This is an episode about what happened, yes, but even more about what the case exposed: failures of parole, contested police choices, and a long public debate about punishment and memory. I'm joined by Dr. Marcus Levin, a criminal justice scholar and former public defender who's written extensively on parole, police critical incidents, and the politics of the death penalty. Marcus, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Elena. It's heavy, but necessary. The Cheshire case sits at the intersection of individual atrocity and institutional breakdown, and we need to look at both. I'm honored to help untangle it.
Let's start, quietly, with the place. Cheshire, Connecticut, a suburban town, quiet, affluent. People there didn't lock doors. That image matters because the shock of the crime fed into a national narrative, a picturesque New England town, and then. Can you say why that contrast became so central, Marcus?
Yeah, it's symbolic. When a violent act happens in a place people associate with safety, well, it ruptures a collective sense of security. The media leaned into that, of course. But from an academic perspective, what happens is the story becomes about restoring order. Legislators react, prosecutors capitalized on public outrage, and policy debates, parole, sentencing, the death penalty, become louder. The family at the center, the Petits, represented ordinary goodness: a doctor, a nurse, two daughters promising futures. That's why the story resonated so intensely.
And for us, it's important to center them as people, not just symbols. I want to talk about who they were. Bill Petit, an endocrinologist, a volunteer, a runner. Jennifer, a nurse and educator. Hayley, 17, headed to Dartmouth, engaged in charity work. Michaela, 11, the caregiver in miniature, planning family dinners. Marcus, when you read about families like this in your work, does the public reaction change how systems respond?
It absolutely can. Public empathy and the visibility of victims affects the political appetite for reform. When victims are high profile, you often see swifter legislative action and sometimes harsher punishment. But that focus can also skew resources toward high-visibility cases while everyday victims receive less attention. That's a tension we have to be mindful of, especially in discussions about policy change.
Right. Okay, let's walk through the crime itself, hour by hour. The chronology matters because a lot of the controversy centers on timing, what the police knew and when. The day before, July 22, 2007, Jennifer and Michaela are at Stop & Shop buying ingredients. Surveillance footage later shows them. Also there, Joshua Komisarjevsky, who notices them, follows them home. He later admits he chose the house at that moment, drawn particularly to Michaela. He surveils the home, returns to his accomplice Stephen Hayes with text messages. Hayes, "We still on?" Komisarjevsky, "Yes." Those texts, they're disturbingly casual.
That casualness is chilling. The texts became critical evidence of premeditation. It's one thing to conceive a crime in the abstract. It's another to send quick, almost joking messages and then execute. And that matters for how prosecutors framed mens rea, intent, and for how juries perceived malice.
They arrive in the night, around 2 to 3 a.m. They enter through an unlocked basement door. Komisarjevsky grabs a baseball bat, attacks Bill on the couch, binds him with zip ties, ropes. They tie Jennifer and the girls to their beds with pillowcases over their heads. They search the house for money, and their plan shifts. They decide to force Jennifer to withdraw $15,000 from her home equity line. Hayes is the one who buys gasoline earlier in the morning, captured on a gas station camera. Marcus. Police get a 911 call from the bank manager when Jennifer signals that she is a hostage. That call is one of the centers of controversy. What do police typically do in a situation like that?
Standard hostage operation doctrine emphasizes containment and information gathering. You avoid immediate, uncoordinated entry because a sudden move can provoke the perpetrators into executing hostages. Officers typically set up perimeters, attempt to establish communication, and prepare a tactical plan. But, and this is crucial, policy is not a substitute for situational judgment. How much information you have, how reliable it is, the apparent demeanor of the hostage, all of that shapes whether a dynamic entry is attempted. In Cheshire, responding officers chose to contain rather than forcibly enter during that window. Many have asked whether that was the right call.
And many people, and I think understandably, ask, could that decision have changed the outcome? From the timestamps we have, the whole chain of events, from Jennifer at the bank to the fire and arrests, compresses into less than an hour. While police are outside, Komisarjevsky sexually assaults Michaela and rapes her. Hayes later rapes and strangles Jennifer. They then pour gasoline and set the house on fire. Hayley and Michaela die of smoke inhalation. Bill, though severely beaten, manages to free himself enough to escape and crawl to a neighbor's house. Marcus. Some have argued that the police could have saved the girls. Others say an aggressive entry could have prompted immediate murder. How do we evaluate those competing claims?
We evaluate them with humility and with the facts. The bank manager's call provided conflicting pieces of information. Jennifer conveyed both that the captors said they didn't want to kill anyone and that they had threatened to shoot. Officers had limited visibility. No one inside could confirm the captor's weapon status or mental state. The tactical calculus is, do you risk precipitating an execution by rushing in, or do you risk losing the chance to save hostages by waiting? From a purely hypothetical perspective, a swift, well-executed tactical entry within that short window could have saved lives. But that presumes perfect intelligence, resources, and execution. Real life is messy. That's why this remains an unresolved, morally wrenching question.
Listen, people listening to this at home are going to hear that and think it sounds frustratingly equivocal. They want an answer. I want to be candid. There is no consensus answer. The Cheshire police defended their actions as consistent with protocol. Critics say they were paralyzed by procedure. Even the Connecticut Supreme Court, when reviewing appeals, acknowledged the complexity, but stopped short of saying police conduct caused the deaths. That lack of closure is part of why the case stuck in the public imagination.
Elena, it's also worth noting that this is not just a single department story. The way we design training, how we resource local departments, and how we coordinate with state tactical teams shapes outcomes in critical incidents. Small towns often don't have immediate SWAT capabilities. They rely on negotiation and containment until specialized units arrive. That structural limit matters when people are in acute danger.
Let's pause for a word. Wow. Okay. Moving on to the perpetrators themselves, we have Stephen Hayes, and later in prison came out as Linda Mai Lee, and Joshua Komisarjevsky. Their backgrounds are different, but both had long criminal records and histories of burglary and property crime. Komisarjevsky's history is particularly troubling. A pattern of nighttime home invasions, voyeuristic tendencies, and convictions that should have signaled danger. Marcus, can you walk listeners through Komisarjevsky's parole controversy?
Sure. Komisarjevsky had been convicted of multiple burglaries, basically a pattern of entering occupied homes at night. He was sentenced in 2002 to a 9-year term with special parole. The parole board released him in April 2007, a few months before the Petit murders. Now here's the critical administrative failure. The sentencing transcript that might have detailed the judge's and prosecutor's descriptions of his predatory behavior was not forwarded to the parole board as required. Without that transcript, the parole board didn't have the full narrative of his danger level. Post-crime investigations revealed that breakdown, and it ignited public outrage and legislative demands for reform.
So, a paperwork failure, an omission, may have contributed to him being released sooner than many thought appropriate. But of course, we have to be careful. Parole decisions are complex, and blaming paperwork risks simplifying accountability. What do you see as the appropriate mix of institutional and individual responsibility here?
We need a layered accountability approach. Obviously, the men who committed the crimes are morally and legally responsible for their actions. But institutions failed in ways that mattered: misclassification of risk, missing records, and perhaps insufficient resources for post-release supervision. Structural factors, overcrowding, plea bargaining pressures, also create incentives for early release. So while individual culpability is primary, institutional failures are both causal and preventable, and they need systemic fixes.
And that's just one of the system failures. Another is the parole and halfway house connection. Hayes and Komisarjevsky met at the Silliman halfway house after being paroled. They bonded over criminal behavior and drug use, and then escalated to this violent burglary. Let's talk trials. Hayes's trial in 2010, guilty verdict, death penalty recommended by the jury, later sentenced to death. Komisarjevsky's trial in 2011, found guilty on all counts, death recommended. But then Connecticut abolishes the death penalty in 2012, and in 2015, the state Supreme Court applies that abolition retroactively, commuting their death sentences to life without parole. Marcus, this legal and political arc is dramatic. How did the Cheshire case factor into debates about capital punishment?
It became emblematic. On one side, victims' families and many members of the public argued that a crime of this magnitude warranted the ultimate penalty, that execution was a proportionate response. Dr. Petit publicly insisted on that for years. On the other side, abolitionists pointed to systemic problems: racial disparities, arbitrary application, moral objections to state execution, and argued that life without parole sufficed. Cheshire was invoked as a reason to keep death on the books by proponents. Abolitionists challenged the premise that execution offers closure or justice. The political reality is that highly symbolic cases shape public opinion and legislative pressure. Connecticut's legislature nevertheless abolished capital punishment for future cases. The 2015 state Supreme Court then extended that logic to existing sentences, commuting the death row inmate sentences. Marcus, this legal and political arc is dramatic. How did the Cheshire case factor into debates about capital punishment?
And that commutation, publicly and emotionally, was devastating to many in Cheshire. Bill Petit was vocal about his anger. He argued that the state effectively reduced justice for his family. Marcus, from a criminal justice perspective, is there evidence that execution offers closure to victims' families? Or is that more of a public story than an empirical one?
The empirical literature is mixed. Some survivors report a sense of closure after execution, but many do not. A lot depends on individual psychology, cultural beliefs, and community narratives. Importantly, the idea that execution provides objective closure is not strongly supported by consistent evidence. What does seem to matter more for survivors is meaningful restitution, ongoing support, and a sense that the system listened and recognized their loss. That said, when a case is as extreme as Cheshire, emotions run very high, and the symbolic demand for retribution becomes part of the public conversation.
That symbolic demand is also part of how we tell the story in the media. HBO released a documentary in 2013 that dug into the crime, the police choices, and parole failures. Media coverage often framed the Petits as the quintessential good family, and that focus raises ethical questions about which victims get prolonged attention. Marcus, what should journalists bear in mind when covering cases like this, especially given the danger of sensationalizing sexual violence and trauma?
There are two guiding principles I recommend: center survivors and minimize harm. Centering survivors means focusing on their lives, their agency, and the ripple effects on community, not just lurid details of the crime. Minimizing harm means avoiding gratuitous descriptions that re-traumatize families or turn victims into spectacle. Also, be wary of simplifying motives. Offenders' backgrounds, trauma, addiction, mental illness can inform analysis without excusing criminality. Responsible storytelling requires nuance.
I agree. That's why this podcast tries to be victim-centered while probing institutional questions. I want to pause and read a short excerpt from the bank manager's 911 call because it's central to the timeline. She describes Jennifer as a hostage, that the perpetrators don't want anyone hurt, but they're threatening to kill. That ambiguous message, "We don't want to hurt anyone, we just want money," is a pivotal piece of intelligence that likely shaped police decisions. Marcus, do you remember how the police used that phrasing in their own after-action accounts?
Yes. The Cheshire PD officials relied on that communicated message to justify containment. They argued that if the perpetrators professed they didn't want to kill, then their actions might align more with extortion than execution. Of course, that message could have been tactical deception. The unpredictability of perpetrators, whether they're lying, whether they're panicked, or whether they escalate for other reasons, makes these situations chaotic. Commandos often say hindsight is 20/20, but that doesn't absolve us from asking hard questions about training, leadership, and judgment.
Hindsight is 20/20, but it's also insufficient comfort to those who lost loved ones. Speaking of loss, let's talk about the nature of deaths in the house. Both girls died of smoke inhalation, not direct trauma. Hayley managed to break free of some restraints and reached the top of the stairs, but collapsed. Michaela remained bound to her bed. Jennifer was strangled. The men then doused the house in gasoline and set it alight. These details are so hard to recount. Marcus, the presence of gasoline, was that part of the plan from the beginning? Or did it represent a panic escalation when Bill escaped?
Based on evidence and the defendant's own statements, gasoline appears to have been purchased earlier in the day by Hayes and brought to the house. That suggests the possibility of arson being contemplated at some stage, but the full motive is murky. It could have been intended as intimidation, a way to destroy evidence, or a contingency to cover an escape. After Bill escaped, the decision to burn the house took on a different, more lethal finality. Determining the point of escalation, when robbery turned into sexual violence and murder, is central to answering why this particular crime became so catastrophic.
Which brings us back to motive and the men's respective roles. Prosecution painted both as co-conspirators responsible for the escalation. Defenses tried to parse who was the mastermind. Komisarjevsky as the planner and selector of the house, Hayes as the follower, the addict, the easily influenced. Komisarjevsky's diary even blamed Dr. Petit, calling him a coward for not saving his family, an appalling attempt at blame shifting. Marcus, how do courts and society assign moral blame in cases like this when lots of small failures and choices contributed?
Courts look at actions, intent, and foreseeability. If you participate in a violent plan that foreseeably risks death, you're culpable even if you didn't personally commit the killing. That's why both men were convicted of murder, and why the prosecution framed it as a shared plan that predictably led to death. Society, though, seeks moral narratives. Who was the monster? Who was the victim? Who was the victimizer? Those narratives often simplify messy realities. Legally, though, the evidence supported joint culpability. The surveillance of the house, the texts, the gas cans, the bank trip, those all point to shared planning and shared escalation.
The trials included ugly, solemn details, harrowing forensic evidence, like Komisarjevsky's photos on his phone, semen in Michaela, bleach used to try to erase DNA. The juries reached guilty verdicts, and death sentences were handed down, later commuted. Komisarjevsky filed appeals arguing, among other things, that some police recordings thought destroyed were later found in 2014, recordings that prosecutors say weren't exculpatory, but that defense argued could have helped cross-examine officers about police response. The Connecticut Supreme Court ultimately rejected his appeal in 2021. Marcus, does that appellate record settle the policing questions for you?
No, it doesn't. Court determinations about fairness and prejudice are legal judgments about whether errors undermined confidence in the outcome. The appellate court concluded that any issues didn't compromise the fundamental fairness of the trials. But appellate denial doesn't equal institutional perfection. The public, policy analysts, and historians can still examine whether different police choices might have mattered, or whether the department's communications and procedures need change. Legal finality and public accountability are related but not identical.
Let's broaden to policy fallout. Following the murders, Connecticut embarked on parole reform, tightening eligibility, improving information flows, calling for better classification for people with patterns of services that indicate high risk, particularly nighttime home invasions. There were legislative changes and public debates about plea bargaining and incarceration rates. Marcus, do you think those reforms addressed the core causes, or were they more political reactions?
Some reforms were substantive and addressed gaps, like codifying information sharing, clarifying parole board procedures, and reclassifying certain patterns as higher risk. But criminal justice reform is iterative and often reactive. Political pressure can produce quick changes that plug obvious holes, but deep structural issues, overcrowded prisons, resource limitations for supervision, and the incentives created by heavy reliance on plea deals remain challenging. The Cheshire case forced acknowledgement of these problems, but solving them requires sustained investment and political will beyond the immediate aftermath.
Which brings up a question that's part moral and part practical. To what extent do we place responsibility on the system versus the individuals? Some people say, if the system had worked properly, this would never have happened. Others say, no system could have stopped two people determined to commit brutal acts. Is this a false dichotomy?
It's a false dichotomy. Both things can be true. Individual agency is primary. Actors made deliberate decisions. But institutions shape opportunity structures. Effective classification, thorough sentencing information, careful parole decisions, robust supervision all reduce likelihood of recidivism. Conversely, systemic failures increase the odds that dangerous people get back into the community. So we must hold perpetrators accountable while also addressing institutional vulnerabilities that contributed to risk.
I want to bring Dr. Petit's post-2007 life into the conversation because it shows how survivors try to translate grief into action. He underwent major medical treatment, founded the Petit Family Foundation to honor his family, eventually remarried, had a child, and later served in the Connecticut General Assembly. He became a vocal victims' rights advocate and opposed the retroactive abolition of the death penalty. Marcus, how do we weigh a survivor's expressed needs for retribution against broader questions about the death penalty's role?
I think survivors deserve to be heard and their wishes respected in the emotional sphere. But public policy ideally should be grounded in a mix of values, empirical evidence, and ethical reasoning. Even when survivors favor execution, policymakers must consider whether capital punishment advances deterrence, closure, or justice in general. Evidence doesn't strongly support execution as superior in these domains. Still, the emotional power of survivors' testimony is profound and rightly shapes the moral conversation. The tension between private grief and public policy is one of democratic life's hardest dilemmas.
And that tension shows up in media coverage as well. Critics argue that the Petit's race, class, and the family's perceived innocence amplified coverage in ways that other victims don't receive. That's an uncomfortable truth about which victims get memorialized and whose stories catalyze reform. Marcus, when we tell these stories, how do we avoid creating hierarchies of grief?
Journalists and storytellers should contextualize, include diverse cases, and avoid implying that some losses matter more. Our criminal justice system would benefit from a steady focus on victims across demographics, not just those who make headlines. That means reporting on neglected crimes, funding for victim services universally, and a policy discourse that doesn't privilege only high-profile tragedies.
Before we move toward closing, I want to emphasize the still unanswered questions you and I both find haunting. Could the police have saved Hayley and Michaela? We can't know with certainty. Why did the crime escalate so brutally, from robbery to rape and arson? We can point to histories of abuse, addiction, and criminal patterning, but none of that excuses the violence. How much blame lies with institutions? We can trace causal lines, misclassification, missing transcripts, but again, complicated. And finally, does the death penalty serve justice? The state tried it, then abolished it, and commuted sentences, leaving a community torn. Marcus, any final reflections on the unanswered before we close?
Yes. First, unanswered does not mean unknowable. There are steps that could make a difference. Better parole documentation flows, more resources for small departments, standardized crisis response training, and investment in victim services. Second, we must hold both individuals and institutions accountable without collapsing one into the other. And third, when we retell cases like Cheshire, do so with humility and respect for survivors. The search for policy answers is ongoing, but it must be tied to human compassion and concrete changes.
Thank you. We'll end this episode not with tidy closure, but with an invitation. To remember the Petits as people, and to keep pressing institutions for accountability. If you want to learn more, our episode notes include a timeline, legal documents, and links to the Petit Family Foundation, the Connecticut Supreme Court opinion in State v. Komisarjevsky, and the HBO documentary. Marcus, thank you for being with me, for your care and rigor.
Thank you, Elena. It's essential we keep talking about these cases in ways that center victims and demand system improvements.
If you're listening and you feel overwhelmed, this is heavy material. Take a break, reach out to someone you trust, and if you need professional support, please seek it. Still Unanswered is produced with a small team devoted to ethical storytelling. If you value this work, please consider supporting our research fund. Details in the notes. This episode was written and hosted by me, Elena Maris, with research assistance from our team and guidance from the sources we list. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another case that resists simple answers. Good night.